So, welcome back to yet another masterclass that took forever to put together. Today we are doing a deep dive into lighting, more specifically studio lighting for product photography, like those animations that you saw just before, because that is actually a great way to go about mastering lights. Now, like many other lectures in this series, the concepts that we will review and learn about today are relevant across the board, meaning that they are good for Blender and for any other software out there. In fact, truth be told, they are mostly good also for the real world too. And so, super quick recap. Right now we are in the middle of doing some masterclass deep dives into fundamental topics like the materials, like composition, lighting, and so on. In fact, in the previous lecture, we learned how to create any material known to man with PBR, both procedurally and with texture. And before that, in the previous lectures, we got introduced to 3D modeling, basic camera animations, and the basics of lighting when we lit Jinx from Arcane with a 3-point system. However, the goal today is to really go in depth about the whole process of mastering light, like true professionals. And to do so, we need to talk once again about physics. Okay, so both in the previous lecture and also in lecture 16, we said that light can behave as a wave, that it has frequencies, and that we perceive it as color. And especially when those frequencies average out, that's when we perceive white light. Now, when we start wanting to place around light sources, the first thing that we need to familiarize ourselves with is how light travels, and more importantly, how it decays. So obviously, light travels very fast, but what rookies often miss is the rate at which light is lost in space. So the one law from physics that you truly need to understand is the inverse square law, which basically means that at the source of light, we have 100% intensity or brightness, right? But if we move away and we double our distance from it, the light that actually reaches us is not half, like many would accept, but rather a quarter. So at double distance, only 25% of the light is reaching us, meaning that we have already lost 75% of our light. That is a lot, and that is why photographers in the real world spend insane amounts of money on lights. Way more than they spend on cameras, they spend on lights, because they need powerful lights, because light gets lost a lot. Okay, so let me position this way. Let me position this way and let's turn on this. So this is the expectation that we have some intensity, and then every time we travel, right, double the distance, then we expect the light to be half. But that is not real. That is not how it really works. The reality of things is that by the time we get from here to here, we have lost 75% of the light. And it continues to go down this way, which means that as soon as we step away from the light, we start to lose a lot of light. But also, I would like to point out, as we go further and further away, then things kind of reverse, and we find out that there is actually more light than there would be if things played out the way we expected them to, if we were thinking that by doubling the distance, only half of the light would reach. So let me say it once again. The inverse square law happens because we have geometric dilution in 3D space, because the quantity radiates uniformly from a point source, right? So every point here that is emitting light is radiating uniformly, and as light has to travel in 3D space, of course, it gets more and more separated, and that is why we lose 75%. If that doesn't click immediately, another way to think about it is if you think about magnets, right? So we said that light is part of the electromagnetic spectrum. So you can think of magnets have a similar behavior, that when you have them really close together, they are really strong, but the further you pull them apart, the less pull they have, and that is not a linear thing. In fact, it follows the same exact law, that as soon as they get far away, the intensity of the magnetic field drops dramatically. And that is why they snap together when they're very close, and why you can hold them easily apart if they're just a tiny bit far away. Now, with that out of the way, we need to talk about the types of lights that we have access to in 3D software. So, like any other object, you can press Shift A, and then you will have the Add menu, and there's a voice that says light, and then you have several kinds, right? You have point lights, sun, spot, and area. And so let's review them. The first one is the point light. So the point light is also known as an omnidirectional light, because it is technically a point in space that is emitting light uniformly in all directions. And so this is perhaps of all lights the most abstract, because we don't really have a one-to-one exact example of it in real life necessarily, if we want to be precise. But the idea is that we have this point that we can move around, and as you can see, it creates a light that is uniform in all directions. And if you go to the properties panels in its data properties, you will see that we have the respective tab, the color, the power, which is expressed in watts, and then we have a radius, which basically tell us how big that sphere is. So right now it is at 0. And because of that, it's like exactly as a point in space. And as a consequence, if we see the trajectory of the light, right, it travels all the way and then casts a shadow. The shadow that it casts, it's super sharp. However, if we were to make this bigger, for example, 10 millimeters, you can see that the edge of the shadows starts to fade and becomes softer. So what we had before is known as a hard shadow from a hard light, and now we have a soft shadow from a soft light. And this is a property that is not intrinsic of point lights, but of all lights, like we'll see in this video. Now, because this light is omnidirectional, it matters where we position it with G, right? It matters where we move it in space, but it doesn't matter how we rotate it. We can rotate it in any way, and it is emitting light uniformly in all directions, so it really doesn't matter. It doesn't change anything. The opposite of it is a sun, which is also known as a directional light. Now, right now, this sun is positioned dead center above this cube, which is creating this very weird looking lighting condition. This in real life only happens in a Y at noon and is known as Lahaina. I think it's pronounced noon, when you have the sun dead center above the earth, and therefore there are no shadows and everything looks like a bad game from PlayStation 2, which is really fun. But this is not how our brains have evolved to understand space. We need shadows to understand depth, and that is why it looks so odd to us. Now, like I was saying before, this is quite the opposite of the point light or the omnidirectional light, because this one doesn't matter where you position it, the effect is just the same, but it matters how you rotate it. Alright, so let me doodle here for a minute. What we have with a point light is a source that is emitting light in every direction, yes? So if we have an object which usually is bigger than a one-dimensional point, right? It goes that the light comes at an angle, and so what we have is that we have shadows that are usually projecting outwards, right? So they are like larger, and depending on the radius of the source, we might have more defined hard edges or softer edges. But regardless, if we move this over here, it's still emitting in a uniform way. And so what we end up having is that this is just the same as this, right? It's pretty much the same size. And so that is why it doesn't change with the rotation, but it does matter with the position, right? Like if we position it in a different place, the shadow will be in a different place. Conversely, this thing right here is an icon, right, that is representing the sun, and obviously the sun is way farther away than this. So this is representing the whole space that we have between planet Earth and the sun, which actually planet Earth is this one and the sun is this one, because the sun is way bigger than Earth and it is way further away. What we have here is that by approximation, the amount of light, despite the sun emitting light in all directions, like you would think of a proper, omnidirectional light, the light that is reaching us is this part, right? And then it goes all the way into deep space. But because we are this tiny dot, if we were to zoom in and look at the light that is coming to us, it is coming to us at basically a parallel angle, okay? So all the rays that are coming through are by all means parallel, or at least for what matters to us. So think how big the Earth is, think how big this cube is, and think how big the sun is, and you can see how, for what concerns this cube at least, the light that is coming through from the sun is absolutely parallel. And that is also why it doesn't matter if the sun is here or 10 centimeters above, because if you think about it, like if you lie on the ground or if you're standing, it doesn't change dramatically the quantity of light that you're seeing, right? Like this thing is so far away that a few centimeters up or down, a few feet up or down. It doesn't matter. It doesn't change absolutely anything from the point of view of your perception. And so that is why for the sun, for directional lights, that's why it matters how it is rotated, but not where it is positioned. Whereas with the point lights, it doesn't matter how it is rotated, but it matters how it is positioned. Okay, before I forget, let's look a minute at the properties of the sun, which you might see are slightly different. We have an angle right now, okay? And this value basically does the same thing as the radius does for the point light and for every other light. So this, although we cannot change the size of the sun, we can change the angle. And when the light of the sun comes at a different angle than this one, if we increase it, we have softer shadows. Back to my doodles. When we have a very low angle, we have a really hard shadow, right? So this is representative of a very clear sky where the sun is just shining through like it's summer and the shadows are super hard. However, as it increases and becomes softer, it becomes representative of an overcast day. Now, an overcast day is when you have clouds. And so what happens is that the light comes through, right? It arrives from the sun and then it hits the clouds. And as you may know, clouds are made of water. And what happens is that the light gets bounced off all the way around by the teeny tiny particles of water, which ends up scattering the light all over the place. And so what happens is that if before the light was coming like this, now it's going all over the place, and it is the equivalent of having a closer, much closer light source that is way bigger, right? Because the clouds are all over the sky. And so this ends up softening the shadows. And that's why we have an overcast day, and why usually pictures on an overcast day don't look as good as, those taken when you have a really nice light with sharp, hard edges. Moving on, the spotlight, which is the equivalent of this object that we have in real life that you may or may not be familiar with, but I think you probably have either seen the object or at the very least seen the kind of light that it produces, maybe in a movie or maybe in real life. This object produces a cone of light, right? And as a consequence of this object being, an object on the scale at which we normally interact with things, it's not gazillions of miles away. It does matter where we position it, and it also matters how we rotate it, right? This is, to all effects, an object like, you could reach and touch in everyday life. And if we look at the properties of it in the panel, we have very similar properties to all the other lights that we have seen before in the radius that indicates the dimensions of it, so we can make it bigger. And as you can expect, this softens the edges. The other thing that we have that is specific to this light is the beam shape. So this kind of lights have barn doors like this that you're seeing, right? Which allow you to control the size of the cone and at the same time the blur of it, how soft it falls out to the darkness. And so this is what those two values do. And as you can see, as I change the spot size and the blend, it is affecting, the surface, but it's not affecting the intensity of the light. So bear in mind that this is not the same as doing this, because if you noticed, I made it bigger, but because it is bigger, also the light is different. If you can pick up the difference, this is less white, less intense, so it's not exactly the same thing. Now, moving further, the sibling of the spotlight is the aerolite, which is kind of similar in that you might have also seen similar objects in real life where rather than having a circular shape, they are, squared. And that is an aerolite. And just like spotlights, aerolites have barn doors, which here are referred to as the spread. And so what you can do is bring the spread down. And as you can see now, it's like if we had very closed barn doors that would focus the beam hard on this squared shape. Whereas if we open them up all the way to 180, they're flat, and then the light is going where it is supposed to go. And of course, because these are also objects that are happening at our own real life scale, it does matter where we position them and also how we rotate them. Cool. So that is an introduction to the basic types of lights. There is more to their properties, and we'll see that later on. But in terms of types of actual lights that you can bring into the scene, that is it. That is also representative of most kinds of lights that could exist in the real world. And the only one that we have not looked at yet is this object, which I've renamed emitter, although it is simply a plane that has an emission material assigned to it, right? So in the previous video, we learned all about materials, so you know what you're looking at. And we have a principal BSDF with an emission and a strength at 1, which is the exact same thing as having just a pure emission shader at 1, exact same thing. Nothing's changed. Remember that the principal shader is just a bundle of all possible BSDF you might want to use. And so what we have here is something that is very similar to an aerolite with some differences, like that you do not have access to the lighting tab, because this is to all effects an object that simply has an emission shader to it. It doesn't have directionality. So if I take this object and I bring it down, you will see that also the other side is creating light. So it is creating light in all directions where the surface exists. And as a consequence, we also do not have the sort of overlay that an area light has, where you can see exactly where the normal of it is pointing. And so the reasons why you might want to use an emitter are several. In most cases, it's because one thing is that is very convenient is that you can actually see it in the scene as opposed to the area light, which is this sort of abstract, invisible square or rectangle. And so in some instances, it might make more sense to you. In many cases, the kind of result that you can achieve is very similar. And also in this case, we have a flat plane, which is acting as an area light, but this could be any object really in any shape. And so if you have something that has a very complex shape and you need your light to have that very complex shape, then that's the way you would go about it. You would 3D model that shape and then have it emit light. All right. So let's keep moving. We now need to talk about the quality of light. So wherever there is light, there is shadow, right? And so what you need to master is the concept that when you are positioning a light, you are also positioning a shadow. So let's look at these 3 examples to understand the density and quality of the light and shadows here. So let me turn B and C off because they are affecting each other, and let's take a look only at scenario A. So what do we have here? We have a light source, right, that is emitting light, and it's hitting our good old Cézanne monkey head. And as you can see, because the light source is relatively small, okay, what we have here is a very elongated shadow that is pretty dense, okay? And so if we compare it to this other scenario B, what we have here is a much bigger light source, and because of it, the shadow here is much more dispersed and softer overall. And so what we need to understand is that the size of the light relative to the subject matters. It matters in the quality of light and the quality of shadow that we are producing. And so this will create for us very soft shadows like what we're seeing here, which is what you may or may not want. So lighting is an art form. There is no right or wrong. It all depends on the subject and the story and narrative that you need to tell. So there is no magic formula where you can say, oh, well, I'm gonna, make it 1/3 of the subject and so on. No, you have to understand the principles, and that will allow you to create your own way to go about lighting. So main takeaway here is size. The size of lighting matters, just like it matters the position, the distance that we have between the light source and the subject. So if you can see over here what we have, you will see it from a side view, is the same exact size of light, except that because this is way further away, and now we know what the inverse square law is doing here, to make it so that this scene feels somewhat illuminated just like this one, we have to make this much more powerful of a light. However, if you can see, while the overall illumination of it might seem like it is the same, the quality of the shadow is totally different we have a totally different result. It's not the same thing, okay? And so the takeaway here is that the distance also matters. And so the relationship between the size, the distance, and the intensity is sort of the triangle that where you have to play your lighting and where you have to make decisions about what kind of light and what kind of shadow you want to create. And moving on, we have been mentioning a lot the density of shadow, and it has to do with the fact that we are operating right now in an environment that is not realistic. So if we look at this Suzanne monkey, right, we immediately notice that the lighting is somewhat off, because what's happening here is that we are in an absolute void. It would be like if this is happening in deep space and there's nothing around us forever, then this might be a good representation of that kind of situation. But it is not a good representation of the kind of everyday experience our brain has of reality. Because what happens in reality, even when you are in a photography studio that is, completely blacked out, what you have is that the light gets emitted and then it bounces off things and comes back, right? So in previous videos, we talked about how you could have an HDRI that, somewhat has the resemblance of a real environment. It's a real capture of the real world out there. And so this provides us with some really realistic reflections and light information that sort of like makes our scene more believable. However, if we don't have it and we are in an absolute black background scene like this one, what is happening is that the light that is traveling here is going through and never coming back. So in a previous video, we introduced the 3-point lighting system and also talked about the importance of having a backdrop, right? So what you might see a lot of people doing is this, and this is actually what I taught you to do in our first basic introduction, to create a backdrop with a limbo, which is this nice curvature that we have here. And as you can see, immediately this affects the scene, right? So if I turn this off, all of this part disappears because it is completely black. But if I bring it back, it already, changes the density of the shadow, because the light is going around and bouncing off and finding its way back over here. However, this still is not realistic, because as I was saying, in a photography studio, still we have an environment that is more complex than this, where, there's no void in a photography studio where the light continues to go forever. And that is why in photography studio, you might see often reflectors, which are sort of like panels that reflect light. They might be as simple or sophisticated as they can be. They vary a lot, but the essence is that you have a surface where the light is hitting and bouncing back off. And if you notice, it already makes a difference. The moment we have that light coming back to us, the light over here, the density is changed. And even if I take off the background now, we can see an isolated view of what that reflector is doing, okay? So this is the density of the shadow the understanding that we need to have of it. And just like in the real world, in 3D space, as you move it, you are able to control that density, right? Because we are adjusting the distance from the light source, and therefore the amount of light that finds its way here, and therefore also the amount of light that then finds its way back again. All right, and for our next topic, we need to discuss the texture of a light source. So here we have an object that is a generic, cosmetic container, tube. This could be sunscreen or something else, doesn't matter. What it matters is the shape that it has, which is perfect for discussing this kind of topic. So what we have here are two of the same objects, and one has applied to it a matte material that has a very high roughness, whereas this one has applied to it a glossy material with a very low roughness. As a result, when the light hits this surface, which by having a higher roughness means that it is way more rugged, and at the microscopic level, basically it is scattering the light that comes off of it in all sorts of direction, and therefore sort of disrupting the clean reflection that you would have. In this case, we have a very nice, very easy way to get away with any kind of lighting, because we do not need to be extremely precise, because this kind of breaks it up anyway, and so we kind of get saved by it. And if our lights are not perfect, it's kind of harder to catch. However, glossy materials that are metallic, that reflect a lot, are harder to get away with it, because the lighting needs to be perfect and the environment needs to be perfect. And what we end up having here is this reflection, which is the light that we have over here, right? And so right now we have an incredibly hard reflection, which is something that we might want or not, but we need to have control over it. It might be that for our story, for the shot that we need to take, it makes sense to have a hard reflection. It fits the picture, or maybe it doesn't fit the picture. And the way we go about controlling it is through having a texture in our light. So right here, I have once again an emitter, a plane, right, that has to it an emission shader. In this case, once again, I have the principal BSDF, but this could be an emissions shader and it would be just the same. And what we have above here is a feed for the RGB color, which in this case is pretty much a white. However, here I have an alternative path with a gradient that I have created that is controlled through this color ramp. And what this does is that it creates on this light for us this sort of fade that then is also reflected in our reflection. And so this ends up softening that edge that we wanted to control. So once again, to see the difference, if I plug in the full reflection, we have this very hard reflection, very well-defined edge. However, if we don't want it, the way we go about it is by controlling the gradient of light through a texture. And like all things, we can, be very precise, very deliberate in how we want it to play out. Now, this is something that is straight out of the toolset of photographers. This is done all the time in real world, except that rather than having, a material with a slider that you can sort of like tweak on the fly, what you end up having in real life is a diffuser, which is a material that basically, diffuses light goes through it. And because of the properties of this material, a little bit like the clouds that we were discussing earlier, it ends up diffusing the light. And so here I have a proper area light that is coming in at an angle, and this is recreating a similar gradient in the material. And so this, once again, is creating a similar effect, breaking out the hard edges of reflections. So this is the texture of lights. And moving on, just like they have textures, lights have shapes, and that also matters. So what we have here are two absolutely perfect spheres that have an almost unrealistically smooth black material. Okay, this is incredibly smooth in a way that would be really hard to achieve in real life. And in between, I just put a separation wall to avoid these two lights affecting each other, so we can clearly see the difference. So on the one side, what we have here is a squared light, and because this is reflecting on a spherical surface, it ends up having this distorted shape where it is no longer a square. And once again, this might be something that we want, that is deliberate or not, and therefore we need to learn how to control it. And this is, on the other side, a plane, just like this one, that has been rounded off, and as a result, the reflection that it creates is much rounder and perhaps fits better in this specific picture. And then, like I was saying at the beginning, with the fact that these are real objects, real 3D geometry that is emitting light, what you could have is also objects that have much more thickness to them, right? These are planes, so technically they are almost non-existent in terms of thickness, whereas this one has a proper volume. And as you can see, I'm using this one to create this dot over here because this is also emitting light as a geometry. It's in fact the same exact shader material that is emitting light. And so this is something that you want to keep in consideration. For example, this might be looking familiar if you think about reflections in the eyes, both when you try to take realistic pictures and when they get abstracted, for example, in animations that are more stylized. You kind of get to see these kind of themes in the drawing of the eyes. Okay, cool. Let's move on. And now we have to talk about light spills and negative fills, which I didn't realize it rhymes. Awesome. So here we have a similar situation like the one before, right? We have a backdrop, we have a light source, and we have some light coming through. However, what we need to be aware is the spill of colors. So right here, I have a reflector, but this time the reflector is red. And so what is happening here is that white light is going and traveling across space. It is finding this object. And why is this object red to us? It is red because it is absorbing all the light all the frequencies of that white light, but it is returning the red one. So the red one is bouncing off, and that is why on this side we have white light coming through, but on this side we have red light. So as you can see, there is red light over here that is spilling or casting from this. And this is not emitting light. This is simply bouncing back the light that is coming from this side. And so what you need to be aware is the color cast of other objects in a scene. You can imagine that if we were in a scene where there are a lot of red objects, despite of the lights being white, my subject would look much more red than it actually is. And so this can be, once again, like everything else in lighting, intentional or not, it should be. And so you must be aware of this, just like you must be aware of the fact that not every color spills in the same way. So depending on the frequency of the color, red, green, or blue, they bounce back in different ways. Now, just like that, we can have a negative fill, which is fundamentally a black reflector. So this occurs also in reality. When we have something black, it looks black because it absorbs all the light, or at least most of it, right? Unless it is a black hole or something painted with Vanta black, this ends up being something that absorbs a good quantity of light, not all of it. Some of it bounces back, but nevertheless, it captures just enough that if we don't have it, the density of the shadow over here, it is much less pronounced. So this is kind of harder to see. But if we had a positive fill, which is white, you would see that this area of the shadow has much less density. It is brighter. Whereas if we have a darker fill, here it gets darker too, because less light is finding its way back. Now, something that instead we can do in CGI that we cannot do in real life is to have an anti-light. Which, sci-fi as it sounds, it is negative light being projected. This in reality does not exist. Okay, we do not witness this in the real world. Okay, but this would be as if our light source would emit sort of anti-photons that would, instead of casting light, cast darkness. Now, this can be used very, very carefully to correct some scenes or to bend the rules. However, it is, I would say, probably one of the most advanced techniques that you could possibly master in lighting. So I would be very, very careful of how we use it, because if we need to resort to this, 99.9% of the times, it probably should suggest us that we are not handling our lights very well. Okay? If we need to cast some anti-light to cast darkness, it means that we are probably not managing our scene at the best possible condition. Anyway, I thought this would be something fun to show, so there it is, the anti-lights. Okay, now something that instead is done all the time in real life is to have a gobo. A gobo is something that you put in front of your light, right where the emission happens, and basically you use it to cast some interesting shadows. So as you can see here, we have a gobo of some palm leaves, and this is immediately creating a much nicer atmosphere, a much nicer looking light that is so much more interesting than just a spotlight, which this is what it is. It is a spotlight, and without it, it would be probably so boring, right? We are illuminating with a simple vanilla spotlight, a vanilla Susan monkey head on a backdrop. So not interesting at all, but the Gobos light makes it immediately interesting. And so this is something that is actually done in light, okay? What Gobos stands for is up for debate. It kind of stands for goes before optics or between optics, but nevertheless, regardless of where the word came from, this is something that is done all the time to selectively create shadows where we want them in a very deliberate way, as opposed to using sci-fi anti-lights, So before resorting to anti-lights, probably would be a good idea to master Gobos lights, which, by the way, you can animate, right? So this leaf, we can also move. It is, in fact, what I did in one of the opening animations. I made it move a little bit as if there was some wind moving the leaves. Okay, we are almost through. And now for something that is a little bit more advanced. We said earlier that we can have textures on light, right? That is actually a thing. And in this case, in this example, what we had was, a classic plane that had an emission shader just like any other object. However, light objects themselves, as in Shift A lights, can have textures. In fact, once you have created them, you can go in the shader editor and click on use nodes, and that gives you access to all sorts of nodes that are specific to lights. So this is in fact what I have done with the Gobos light that we just reviewed. Rather than placing a spotlight and then creating a plane and then assigning to that plane a texture of the leaves and then making, the part that is white, transparent, and then instead keeping the black of the leaves in the texture so that the light could shine through it and so on, you can have a much, much easier life by simply plugging the texture directly into the nodes of the light, right? That is what happened over here. And so what we are about to review are EIS, which is a much more advanced way to control light. So IES stands for Illuminating Engineering Society, which is a body that has, come together over time to define precisely the properties and behavior of different kind of lights. And they created the IES profiles. So think it like this. Just like you can define the geometry in 3D space of a object accurately and 3D model it, light too can be defined in a very precise way. And so all the objects that we have are kind of generalized abstraction of types of lights. However, if you want to recreate precisely a specific light that exists for real, you can use its profile to recreate it digitally as an exact copy. Obviously, not an easy thing to do, and that is why this body of professionals and experts about lights have created profiles. Anyway, here we have two that I have set up for you to kind of demonstrate what is happening over here. And so let's actually take a look at this one first. What do we have here? First of all, we have a node that is specific to lights, which is the black body node, which allows us to input a precise temperature for the light. What's the temperature? The temperature of the light means its color, okay? And so the higher it goes, the more bluish it becomes. So right now we have a very blue light. This is almost like the headlights of a car. Whereas if the temperature was very low, it would be very red. So if this is confusing, remember that this is tied to the frequencies of the electromagnetic spectrum, okay? And that this is measured in Kelvin. This is actually how lights are measured in real life. When you buy a light, it tells you in Kelvin which kind of light it produces, if it's warm or cool. And because this is a color, it plugs into the color socket of our emission. However, then we have an EIS texture, which plugs into the strength of the light. So let me show you. If I unplug this, here we have what a normal, regular spotlight looks like with a very, low strength, sure, but this is what it looks like. However, if I plug this profile in, what we have is something that is slightly more sophisticated, and somehow it immediately looks better. Why is that? Because this, like I was saying, is a general abstraction of light, and it doesn't have all the nuances and imperfections of real life lighting. Whereas having this profile brings in all that richness. And here I have another EIS texture that is also set to a very, very low strength. And look at this. This is a completely different light. This has a totally different feeling to it. And as you can imagine, there are thousands of these profiles for very different kind of lightings that represent different kind of conditions. And so what I have here are two images from the Unreal website that kind of demonstrate how you can have different profiles that create all sorts of different kind of realistic lighting. So this is something that you concern yourself with when you're really chasing something that looks super realistic. And as you can see, these are the profiles of the different lights. And to kind of finish our demonstration about it, here I have a duplication of the same spotlight with the same two profiles that we saw, projected straight on the wall. And here you can get a sense of how they make a difference. So here we have this kind of profile is creating this kind of lighting on our subject. And if I change it, here we have a completely different lighting. And so once again, this is something that you use to create very rich scenes that really go after the nuances of realism. Okay, and now for the best part. Let's talk about the purpose and narrative of lighting with some real application of all the knowledge that we have been discussing so far. So here we have Le Rouge Interdit by Givenchy, one of their flagship lipstick products. So we have a 3D model of the lipstick. This is a relatively simple shape after all, and a hard surface 3D modeling, not too far from what we have seen before, just, more carefully put together. And then we have a camera, nothing that we haven't seen before, that has been set as the active camera. And behind it, we have a gigantic backdrop that is creating a ton of light, right? So this is, once again, just a plane with an emission shader plug into it. And already this is creating a very interesting situation. And to go back to the topic of purpose and narrative, we already touched upon this when we first discussed the 3-point lighting system. And we said that lights are there to tell the story, the narrative of the shot that we need to take. So here, what do we have? We have a product that has very hard shapes, right? And it is a luxury product, and it is a lipstick, and it has a very glossy black finish to it because it has to feel like a luxury item, and it has a very dense, cool red to it. So overall, what the vibes that this product gives are that of being cool, a cool item. And so the way we want to go about it is to have maybe some harsher lights that keep it cool. The number one thing that we can do is to bring in a reflector. And if I create one at the bottom, and I go over here to show it to you, we have a very simple reflector. So the light is coming from here and it is bouncing off, and immediately it brings that light that we are creating over here back to the front, right? So here we are working exclusively with one light. We do not need the 3-point lighting system, just one light, carefully and masterfully used. So the reflector here brings back that light that was getting lost into the endless void of space, and already brings about pretty much the entire product that we need to see, right? So we have this very beautiful design with very beautiful details of the textures of the materials. But this thing doesn't fly. This thing, we cannot have it in frame. And that is why from the properties panel, we have the option under ray visibility to untoggle this from what the camera sees and basically make it as if it was, to all effects, an area light, right? So an area light would produce the light without necessarily being in the way of the camera. And this is what we are doing here. We are sort of like switching on and off properties of this 3D model object that we are using as a reflector to fundamentally create something very similar to an area light, except this is not emitting light. This is just bouncing off light that is coming through. In the real world, this would be a little bit harder to achieve. You would have to be very skilled and deliberate and careful about where you are placing your reflector and make sure that it doesn't step into the frame. And then what else? We can bring about another reflector over here. Same deal. It is invisible to our camera. And I have skewed it at the side because I want to have this light over here, this reflection over here, that is giving me a read on the shape of this lipstick and also a very pleasing reflection on the glossy material that is offset. Now, once again, this could have been flat in front of the camera and it would have created, a very centered reflection, but that would have felt very much static. Whereas we want something that is cool, that is dynamic, even if it's standing still, even if it is just a box, right? So we want something that is not boring, and that is why we skew it to the left. Or we could have done it to the right, but here we go. Now, something else that we could do, for example, is that we could take this backdrop and make it also invisible. And so, in real life, in the real world, what you could have had is a plane like this one in front of the camera, and then you would have a small cut into it, and then your lens would go through it. That is how it is done in real life, that you have to, carve into the reflector for the lens of your camera to actually see what's happening. But in the 3D world, we can just click this and things get lost. And now look at that. We have something super slick with that light coming from the back and performing fundamentally the role of a rim light that is very clearly defining the outline of our object, and then a reflector at the bottom and one offset to the left to create fundamentally what a key and fill light role would be. So here we have the purpose of the lights and their narrative coming together with a lot of intentionality. Something else that we could do instead of turning this off is instead bring about a mirror, right? So here we have a mirror surface that is just a very, reflective object that is creating this effect for us. And now we have something of an image that we might see, for example, on an e-commerce, right? So it's something that looks very familiar. This is very close to how the actual product is presented to you on the Givenchy website. So this is how those shots are taken. In fact, nowadays, most shots that you see taken of products are made like this because, as you can imagine, for a company, it is much more cost effective to hire a 3D artist that can create a perfect image right away in 3D rather than having to hire a photographer who needs to have access to expensive cameras and expensive lights and an expensive studio. And then you need to send the product to the photographer, and the photographer needs to take the photos. And then, there's maybe a little bit of dust, or maybe, I don't know, something else is in the way. And so there is the post-processing involved and some retouching that needs to happen. And all of that ends up being a gigantic bill for the company. And so you can imagine that you have to do it for a lot of products. It becomes really expensive really fast. Whereas 3D art can solve that problem. And that is why 3D artists can earn quite a lot. At the same time, this is a lot more accessible. And so it makes it also very much more competitive because there are only so many companies that need to get the job done. And at the same time, there are trillions, well, not trillions, but a lot of 3D artists. Anyway, without losing the focus of our conversation here, our next example is one of the flagship designs of Dior. And we have, once again, our camera and our 3D model. And right now, what you are seeing is a very dimmed HDRI that is coming in at just 1/10 of its original color. And then what is happening all over here that might be confusing is simply that I have collapsed my nodes, and here I have a solid, brown color over here, a very bronzed color that is coming at 100% intensity, and it's all fitting inside a mixer that is using this node, the light path node, which is taking the camera information and fundamentally allowing us to have a full solid color background while the reflections are receiving the information from the HDRI. Okay, so in other words, we are retaining the light of the HDRI, but not the background of it. A very little neat trick, but I'm keeping it to a minimum because we need to do the actual work with our lights, not with the HDRI. And so the first thing that we can have, once again, is our light that is happening over here. And then we have a backdrop that I made of this, sort of denim blue. Why is that? Because here we have an object that once again, it's a luxury object, but it is a very round, organic shape. It's very feminine and it's made of leather, which if you think about it, is soft and warm as opposed to a hard, cold surface. And so here we want a narrative that tells us of the warmth of this object. However, we are opposing it to a cool palette in the background. So the background is cool, which is further away, whereas something that is warm is closer to us. And so here you can see how the whole psychology of it and logic of constructing a narrative plays a key role in how you go about setting up your lights. And what do we have then? We have a reflector just at the bottom that is at an angle and it is reflecting some light, to bring back that D. And then what we have is a spotlight with a gobo, but the spotlight has been made with a really large radius. And as a result, we are not seeing any of those, leaves that you would see before, like this. But instead, we are leveraging that texture to create those very, soft shadows over here. And so we are playing with the density and the quality of lights and shadow in a way that speaks to this object. And then finally we have a bling, which just adds a little bling over here. And that bling is nothing but a sphere like the one you see before with an emission assigned to it. And that is all. And what happened in the animation is simply that I had the temperature of my light changing gradually over time. So starting very low at something like this and then going up. And as you can see, this is also a beautiful lighting with this very saturated highlights, and the whole scene is warm, which is kind of reinforcing the narrative of the object. And then it goes all the way to the cool tones where it creates some contrast and therefore pops the object out, separating it, distinguishing it from the background. And finally we have this Santal Royal by Guerlain, which is a fragrance. And once again, another luxury product. This time, what do we have? Santal Royal. So royal, something royal. And as you can imagine, what is royal? Where gold and black feels pretty much royal. So this is themed after the queen bee, and all of products have this honeycomb theme with the flowers and the bees and so on. So once again, what do we have here? Something that needs to feel sophisticated and warm and exotic with a hint of, mystery to it. And so what do we have here? The usual camera, very simple. The difference is that it is now in a vertical portrait format rather than the landscape, and you do so by changing the format in the scene from the properties panel. And what else? What we have here are, some objects now that are making a little bit of a scene. As you can see, it is minimal. It is a very abstract scene. There's nothing to it that is not supposed to appear in frame. We have a very simple block and a curtain with a material to it that is creating this sort of like satin effect. And then let's break it down. Without any lighting at all, we still have some global illumination coming in from our HDRI, okay, which is already setting the tone for us. It's already going in the right direction. And then what we have is a proper area light that is creating for us fundamentally what a rim light needs to do. However, we are doing this very, very subtly because on the other side, we are coming in with our main light, our key light, which is our spotlight with a gobo onto it that is bringing up all of that exotic flavor to the image that speaks to the narrative of the object. And because here we are playing with the positive and negatives, with the darkness of the shadows that we are casting, we do not want to come in with the area light and wash it away totally, right? We only want the area light to come and fill the scene without canceling out all those shadows that are making our object really tell its story. And in the end, we have a reflector, okay, that is sort of like completing the lighting in the scene and adding some more interesting reflections on this very polished metal object. Okay, and so this is it for this lecture. And so once again, first of all, we learned about the inverse square law to understand how light behaves in the geometry of space. Then we learned about all the resources that we have access to in our software, all the types of lights. And then we learned about the quality of light, the quality of shadow, and their density, and the texture of those light sources and their shape. And then we learned about how light can spill or get casted, and also how we can play with negatives. So remember, whenever you are placing a light, you are also placing a shadow. Okay, so you must be as deliberate in curating the light as you are in curating the darkness. It's all about balance. And then we looked at some more professional things like Gobos lights and IES profiles, which are very real things from the real world of photography. And finally, we saw some true application of all those principles, and we talked a lot about the purpose and narrative of lighting, just like we did with our previous video on 3-point lighting. So I hope that this was valuable to you, that you learned a lot. We surely covered a lot of ground, and I'll see you in the next video.